Chenette, all right, anglicized. And we want to thank him for joining us virtually all the way from the San Diego County. And but before we get going with Stephan, I want to thank our sponsor, Sonotype. And we have Wes Hagman from Sonotype, who's going to say a few words. And let me stop my share. And Wes, it's all yours, my friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, like I said, my name's Wes Hagman here. I'm on the Sonotype.
Much appreciated. And again, much appreciation for the sponsorship, helping OWASP Los Angeles.
Thank you.
So welcome again to the OWASP, actually it's September meeting. I thought I had fixed that. I want to say a big hello to all of you and to Stephan. A little bit about OWASP Los Angeles before we get going. Many of you are repeat visitors, but for those that are not, we have over 2,100 meetup members. We've come a long way since we started. We are one of the original host chapters of the ATT&CK California conference, arguably the best conference you will ever go to. We're a great community of wonderful professionals giving a lot of their time, supporting open source, and allowing you to interact and maybe get some solutions to some of the issues you're struggling with at work. So we ask you to join us if you already have not. We used to meet, it was a lot easier. Remember, 70 to 90 of us sitting around having nice buffet dinner and talking about our issues and our solutions. That's in check for now. We hope to get back into that. And we're known for getting great speakers, as you can see by today. And this is something we'll continue to do, whether we're virtual or in person. And getting those speakers is a team effort, and getting these meetings planned and everything set up correctly is a team effort. I want to give a shout out to a wonderful board of directors, my fellow board members. I'd march anywhere with you guys. Thank you so much for everything you do. Much appreciated. Next meeting is the 28th. It's always the 4th Wednesday, and it's always at lunch during the virtual times. We have Curtis Yanko, who will be joining us. I think, Wes, you know Curtis. And he's going to talk about applications and DevSecOps. So I encourage you to join us. Mark your calendar. You can register on Meetup for all of our meetings. And besides Meetup, we have a presence on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So please do look for us. We try to share valuable content and start discussions on a variety of things. We hope that you can meet with us. Don't forget, if you care about the OWASP community, you should consider joining us. I'm talking on the top of the perspective now, because I'm always looking to help support OWASP, not just OWASP Los Angeles. I happen to be on the global board of directors, and I'm running again for re-election. I want to endorse a fellow person who's running, Haral Tsitsivius, is running for re-election. I know him for many years. He was a co-chair at ATT&CK California. If you want to participate in the election, you must become a member by the 30th of September. It's only $50, tax deductible, but most importantly, it's going to a really good cause. So do consider helping put Haral where he belongs, on the seat at the Global Board of Directors. The board needs somebody looking after chapters, because they forget about chapters quite a bit, and we need someone like Haral. So please do. If you're interested in sponsoring, maybe you were here in time to see that Wes had some time to talk about his company. That could be your company. Do consider helping OWASP Los Angeles and helping OWASP, and sharing information about your company and making a new contact or two. Just let us know. You can go to this link or email me or hit me on LinkedIn. I'll definitely connect you. Appreciate that. And thanks again, Wes. You're home. You got more time now, I would assume, because very few of you are traveling like you used to. So you can catch up on ATT&CK California videos. on the YouTube, on the OWASP channel. So take a look. Our videos also for our previous virtual chapter meetings are posted as well. So take a look. It's probably better than going to Snapchat, right? So now's the time that I'm going to turn over controls to Stephan Chenette. He's the founder and CTO of ATT&CK. I remember when he was in the early stages of building that company. He's come a long way, highly successful, and he's got some great stuff to share with us. So I want to welcome you back, Stephan. It's all yours, my friend.
All right, thanks, Richard. All right, let me just share my screen here. Okay, and I'm just going to do full screen. All right, can everybody see my screen? Is it in full screen mode?
Yep.
Yep, perfect, thank you. Well, thanks, Richard. I'm going to talk today about operationalizing MITRE ATT&CK. As Richard said, I started a company about 7 years ago, and I also help run the OWASP San Diego chapter. The other thing that Richard, you had mentioned was AppSec Cali. I can't endorse it enough. I was lucky enough to help volunteer the first few years when it started. I help volunteer for the call for papers, as well as for the capture the flag. Phenomenal venue, phenomenal event, great conference. As you guys can see on the screen, like I've been to a bunch of different conferences. I always enjoy AppSec Cali. So thanks, Richard and team, for always running that. The more pertinent thing I think to this presentation though is that I've been involved in MITRE ATT&CK since it was kind of published as a knowledge base since 2015, and more recently, MITRE, along with ATT&CK, the company I started, and a number of research partners started the Center for Threat Informed Defense, and so I've been spending a lot of time on CTID. And it's where we'll take our research time on the resources and even research dollars and listen to the attack community as far as what should be focused on. And that could be the attack matrix for cloud, for ICS, focusing more on attack emulation plans, and actually spending time on that, time, money, resources to make progress on it. And so recently we released the FIN6 emulation plan with MITRE and a number of other research partners. So that's been where I've spent a lot of time. My past is that I ran research for IOActive, been in San Diego for a long time, and as Richard heard, kind of as we were all jumping onto the Zoom, in the last year I decided, and the timing has been very interesting, just to go completely remote. So although San Diego is where I've probably spent the last 20 years, I kind of hop around the US now, and it's very interesting in quarantine times to do that, to go and spend a week here and a week there working remotely. It takes working remotely to a whole new realm. And so, yeah, it's changed me. You can see through the photo. It's just also been interesting to be that flexible in where I work and how I interact with everybody. Okay, so I found these kind of Zooms interesting. I know everybody is kind of listening intently, but just to make it a little bit interactive, unless it's the chat window or the chat feature has been deactivated, these are some of the concepts and diagrams I'm going to talk about when I talk about operationalizing MITRE ATT&CK and how you can make use of the attack knowledge base and framework. So I thought it would be interesting. Make sure you guys know where the chat feature is within Zoom, and in normal times, I'd probably throw out a T-shirt if we were all in the same physical room, or some kind of, like, maybe not throw a Yeti cup, but that would be a prize. But I'll figure out something. Want to see if anybody can identify these diagrams: A, B, C, and D. Use the chat feature if you can. I can't see it; it's not there. But Anil or someone else from the OWASP LA team will tell me if anybody can identify these particular diagrams. A, B, I'll just give you a second to do it, because these are diagrams and concepts that we're going to talk about.
Looks like we have a few folks responding.
Right.
Yeah, it looks like everybody's identifying it as a CIA triad.
Yeah, so that's D. How about A, B, or C? Does anybody know what those are? So I'm gonna put the answer up right now. So put in the answers real quick.
I thought A was how people are coping with the sequestration right now.
Right? All right, so I put up the answer. So A is the pyramid of pain. This is actually a really important concept as a whole when we talk about MITRE ATT&CK. I gave a talk at Eco Party, I think 5 years ago when I was at a different company, and I was talking about defeating detection mechanisms, heuristic logic, machine learning, whatnot. And I was looking at different methods of how, whether it was an endpoint product or a network product, they would look at attacker techniques and tactics. And obviously looking at, a file hash might be the simplest defensive perspective, but also the easiest and very trivial for an attacker to change. And the whole point of the pyramid of pain is as you go up the pyramid, it's easier for an attacker to change their IP address, change the infrastructure that they're using, their domain name, simple. It's annoying to change kind of some of the host artifacts. Using the tools that they utilize might be more difficult, and the TTPs being kind of representative of the behavior that a particular threat actor uses is tough. It's kind of like your MO if you're a criminal. It's something that it's tracked. It's the same type of behavioral signature, and it's harder in many cases for a detection technology. But if they're able to detect or prevent and monitor behavior, that's really where, no matter what happens, one pattern is going to most likely occur again and again and again in terms of the form of behavior. And so it's a way to think about attacks and defenses, and the more at the top of the pyramid that you have the ability to detect or prevent from a behavioral perspective, you're more likely to monitor, respond effectively in the future. We won't go over the other diagrams, but this is one definitely that we'll mention. Here's one more, and then this is the last one, and we'll kind of jump into MITRE ATT&CK. But can anybody label or identify these diagrams, these concepts, A, B, C, D, E? I'll just wait a few minutes to see. Neil, let me know if anybody's.
Yeah, we're getting one response is B is NIST CSF.
Yep.
We're getting a few kill chain, MITRE ATT&CK, Lockheed Martin kill chain.
Yep. Normally everybody gets C, very few people got E, and E is actually new for me in the last year. But so Lockheed Martin kill chain, kind of in a way a precursor to MITRE ATT&CK. We'll talk about it a little bit. Yep, NIST cybersecurity framework. C is the OODA loop, more of a kind of military terminology, but definitely used in the commercial world. And then E is actually something that was sent to me from a CISO friend of mine, just called the CISO hierarchy of needs, and I hadn't seen it before. But fundamentally thinking about building up a incident response program, solid architecture with good hygiene, a solid risk management program, and then looking at how you're testing down the stack from an offensive security perspective. All right, well, that always kind of kicks it off a little bit to start to perceptualize what we're going to start to talk about from what kind of concepts and strategies that we'll think about with MITRE ATT&CK and how you might be able to use it. So I help run OWASP San Diego, and one of the things is we have a fantastic group, just like you do here in LA, and we have a variety of different folks with different experiences. So although many of you have probably heard of MITRE ATT&CK, I'm going to touch briefly on just kind of an introduction. I'll probably relate a kind of a founder story of when I started Attack IQ and how important MITRE ATT&CK was. We'll go over some of the primary use cases, and there's 4 that both MITRE ATT&CK and myself have promoted for some time in terms of how to use MITRE ATT&CK to be helpful within your own security team and to the business. And then, there's more and more these days the discussion of how to translate when we discuss security and threats and defenses in particular, where for so many years I was just in this world of thinking about the threat and the technical aspect, and then more and more trying to understand how that related back to the business, and so how to communicate MITRE ATT&CK and maybe output from that back to the business. So for those of you who haven't kind of familiarized yourself with MITRE ATT&CK, it's obviously exploded in the last I would say 3 years. There is not many companies that aren't doing a webinar and talking about how their network or boundary endpoint cloud detection protection mechanisms fare up against looking at adversarial, TTPs within MITRE ATT&CK. You're seeing presentations. I wasn't able to attend Gartner Security Summit this year. It was virtual, but last year they had a physical presence, and almost all of the seminars mentioned MITRE ATT&CK. If you log into Recorded Future or CrowdStrike or any number of security products today that deal with detection, response, and prevention, most likely they'll have some mapping to MITRE ATT&CK. So it's everywhere. And so it's going to be mentioned, if you're not already familiar with it, within your security team, both from a infrastructure perspective, and this also relates back to application teams. So my experience so far with it is, dealing with a lot of the infrastructure teams that want to be very flexible with allowing business applications to exist and be pushed out and accelerate the business where it needs to. But at the same time, understanding past compliance, the defensive security posture of the infrastructure where all these apps live. And how do you measure that? How do you actually understand what the security posture is, whether it's resilient enough against key attacks? And so many of these infrastructure teams are looking at MITRE ATT&CK to explain back to the business, going, well, yep, here's the infrastructure that we have. Here's the business applications on the infrastructure, and here's how we've measured the resilience of the infrastructure and all the security controls in and around it. And so more and more it's becoming the language to explain the security posture in and around all business critical assets. All right, let me move this a little bit. Okay, so what is MITRE ATT&CK? Before MITRE ATT&CK, we looked at a lot of different conceptual ways to explain an attacker kill chain, the Diamond model, Lockheed Martin kill chain. And one of the key things, the ingredients that were missing, was not the tactics, which is kind of what does the attacker want to achieve in terms of persistence or maintaining control or exfiltration or lateral movement, but how they're going to accomplish that. And that's the difference between the tactics and the techniques element. And so MITRE ATT&CK was first introduced publicly in 2015. I had worked very closely with that team and learned a lot from them, and was able to exchange kind of a lot of notes. But MITRE as itself is a government nonprofit, right? And they had needed a way to explain internally as well as externally a common language in terms of adversarial behavior. And so they had created ATT&CK, which is more than just a matrix of techniques and tactics. It's a knowledge base. And so it really allows us to explain, and here's an example on the bottom right here, a group like Fancy Bear, like what techniques are they using? How are they moving around the network? And previous, we would have a multitude of different ways to explain. Well, here's the technique they used. Here's how they moved around once they got to that machine. Here's the tools that they used and how they used it. And whether you would read a different threat report, it would be said, 10 different ways. And MITRE ATT&CK allowed us to have that common lexicon, that common language, that common way to communicate. Yes, techniques is certainly a part of it, but how to explain the procedural part of that technique, how to explain the group and the behavior, how to link groups together. And again, it comes back all to that behavior when we were talking about that pyramid of pain. If you're able to detect and prevent the behavior of an adversary, you have the most resilient and most likely chance of being able to protect critical assets in the future. And if you're only doing it by, say, a hash or an IP address, that's going to change a week from now and 2 weeks from now. They might be using polymorphic binaries, infrastructure that's constantly being put up and put down. But if we're looking at the behavioral aspects, again, that builds up a more resilient security program. When you take a closer look, and MITRE ATT&CK has been updated actually in the last year quite a bit, not just with more techniques, but we'll talk about sub-techniques in just a second. But as you look across MITRE ATT&CK, you'll see initial access, execution, persistence, privileged escalation. This is kind of the formation, and the thought here is looking at an attacker from left to right, closest to the pin of the endpoint that has been compromised. So when you think about MITRE ATT&CK, you really should wrap your head around that. The thought is post-compromise, right? So I know for so many years, the thought around a defensive prevention strategy was, well, let's not let the attackers get in. And MITRE ATT&CK does have a pre-attack perspective now, but primarily it's still focused on, well, let's assume that an attacker gets into the network, gets access to the machine, has actually compromised, a web application to do that, accessed credentials to do that, but whatever they've done, they're inside. But they haven't gotten to the crown jewels yet. They have not gotten to really what matters to the business. Then how do you start to look at execution, persistence, PrivEsk, defensive evasion, credential access, discovery, all the tactics that are going to be utilized to ultimately get to their goal, accomplish the attacker's goal, and get that information, the data, the assets, whatnot, out. And so it's a way to look post-compromise at attacker behavior. So we talk about TTPs all the time, and a technique is that specific behavior to achieve the goal. The tactic you can think of as the categorical kind of alignment of what they want to accomplish. The technique is how they accomplish it. But typically the how might be like using PowerShell, but that's not enough information. And so when you look at the bottom right here, might have a sub-technique or technique where they talk about, well, the attacker could use PowerShell as a mechanism around credential access. Well, as we know, PowerShell, by most of us that are in a Windows environment, is a completely legitimate tool to use for administrative purposes, but it's also used by attackers. And so that's when we talk about the procedural, the P of the TTP aspect here. And this is when you are using PowerShell in a particular way that makes it malicious, and that's the difference between it being a benign administrative tool in Windows and it being used maliciously. And so many cases, this is something, as you become more and more familiar with MITRE ATT&CK, that I think is very important to note. When we go look at all the tactics and techniques, and we're like, oh yeah, PowerShell or use of Mimikatz to dump credentials. Obviously, Mimikatz is not a legitimate tool. That's plainly malicious. But there are many, many cases within the attack matrix here that the context absolutely matters. And that's when we talk about the procedural aspect. So I had mentioned sub-techniques. So in this past year, I got to speak at MITRE ATT&CK, and right before MITRE ATT&CK, Blake, who is one of the founders of MITRE ATT&CK and the concepts there, had done a talk and a blog, and MITRE ATT&CK maintains a phenomenal blog, so I urge you to search for it and find it. But they had talked about sub-techniques, and sub-techniques came about because as we looked at the matrix, And as the attack community continued to contribute more techniques that they saw within a Mac OS environment, a Linux environment, a Windows environment, and there's matrices for each of those operating systems, more techniques for cloud environments, techniques and particular matrices for ICS. That list got massive. And it started to become obvious that there were a lot of groupings of particular techniques. And so the decision by the MITRE ATT&CK team was made to really look at the matrices and formulate that there's kind of parent techniques, and then within the groupings of those parent techniques, there are sub-techniques. And so, as an example here, I'm kind of showing a breakout. If you go to attack matrix, if you just go to the portal, you can kind of see the parent-child relationship between the techniques and the sub-techniques. And as you look at something like account discovery, you'll see, which is a technique, you'll see sub-techniques like local account, domain account, email account, cloud account, and how the methodology is to access that. And again, you can look then at the procedural example of how that's used maliciously. So discovering a particular account might be an absolute legitimate thing that administrators doing, but there are examples, and the knowledge base within MITRE ATT&CK will show examples of how that's done maliciously. And in many cases, it's not simply just that it's done, it's that it's done by a particular user in a particular context. And again, so that's very important to always note is it being accomplished by root, by system, what user at what times. And so a lot of the context is within the procedural discussion and examples. And again, this all comes back to that MITRE ATT&CK is not just a matrix, it's a knowledge base with a lot of examples. The other big thing to note about MITRE ATT&CK, and you might have heard the term attack bingo. Where this comes from is when we look at the attack matrix, we find techniques, and they're all independent from one another. And in many cases, we call this atomic testing, or attack techniques that are atomic techniques. And so when you look at any of these independently, and you look at a particular detection technology or prevention technology, in some cases, just executing that technique alone is not malicious, or it's not suspicious enough that would trigger an endpoint detection technology, an EDR, EPP type technology. But in other cases, it is. And so just execution, again, I'll go back to Mimikatz just because it's so prevalent. Execution of Mimikatz, a very popular example, is all that's needed to be seen if it can be determined that it's following a certain sequence within that unique technique, that as an atomic action, that's enough for an endpoint solution to determine that's suspicious, it's malicious, and depending on the policy that's set, it'll either be prevented or detected for the team to respond to. Versus what's known within MITRE ATT&CK called emulation plans. So you know the concept of an attack path or an attack chain, an attack graph. John Lambert at Microsoft talks about this fairly common, and I'm going to fuzz up his quote, but I think he has something to the notion where he's, defenders think linearly and attackers think in graphs, something like that. And that's very true, where an attacker might try a particular technique followed by one or more other techniques, but not just in sequence, but depending on what the outcome is, they're going to really follow an attack graph. And within MITRE ATT&CK is something that's released. And right now they're working on the format of how they're going to be releasing this. But right now it's done very anecdotally. It's not done as structured, I think, as it will be done in the future. But we actually worked with them recently and released the Fin6 emulation plan. And we're not the only ones. There's a lot of different teams and volunteers that are members of CTID that are working on emulation plans. And again, this is a huge community effort within MITRE ATT&CK. But emulation plans, when the research team kind of got together and asked the community, what's the most important thing to work on? Emulation plans was one of the top topics that came up. And it makes sense. It's just because when we look at a particular technique in itself, an attacker is not going to come in and just do one thing. They're going to do a number of different things. They're going to spread what they're going to do over time. But truly, they're going to have some type of attributable attack graph that really represents a particular attack group. And that's what we did with Fin6 as an example. There are particular patterns of the independent behaviors when chained together that represent Fin6. So Palo Alto has a great resource that I've linked at the end. MITRE ATT&CK has a great resource when we talk about emulation plans that you can look at. But this is just another example of how MITRE ATT&CK has been used to really build out the common techniques and explain these techniques across the board using a common lexicon, but to build up an attack chain, explain that, and then share that. Again, they're going to be doing, I think, an improved effort in the future of how they share it structurally. The last thing I'll kind of do for an intro perspective is just to talk about that. It's not, again, just about the techniques here. If you dive into the knowledge base, what you'll see is discussions about adversary groups. You'll see discussions on how to interact with a lot of the resources within attack programmatically. So they have a taxi server that you can interact with, and you can pull down the techniques and the tactics and the sub-techniques and the procedures. You can pull down, if a technique is actually run, what is the mitigation strategy. That's fairly broad, by the way, because they're offering, kind of best case examples that would apply to kind of a broad audience, but you can pull down what those mitigation strategies are. And the best way to do that is to interact with what they have from a taxi server and pull that down programmatically. So interacting with MITRE through their portal and their knowledge base, and as well through the taxi server has been very successful for many teams. So that's the intro. My interaction, as I said, when they released MITRE ATT&CK publicly in 2015, it was music to my ears. As Richard had said at the beginning, and he and I have known each other for some time, prior to Attack IQ. I was been going to RSA as another conference, and not as cool as AppSec Cali. I'd always go to AppSec Cali before choosing to go to RSA, but I've been going to RSA a long time. I mean, this is the first year that I haven't gone since, like, I think 2002. But in 2013, I was there, and I was on a panel, and I thought I was asking a question that would have at least an answer from some of the CISOs on the panel. And the question was really, how do you guys demonstrate that your defenses, your security stack is effective once an attacker gets in? And again, the point is, I was talking about post-compromise. I was really interested more so in when an attacker gets in. 2013 era was the big, assume an attacker will get in kind of error. And so I thought it was a pretty straightforward question. I was really interested in the, when an attacker gets in and they start using tools like, tools, had ransomware and started to, search directory structures and encrypt files. If PowerShell was used or WMI was used maliciously, if sticky keys was used to kind of install a background, what were the defenses in place? How did you actually demonstrate that you had a stack, that you weren't just an eggshell, and that you had controls in place? You can see this kind of visual here where I had been very familiar with the vulnerability management world, in my time at EI and working on Retina, very familiar with pen testing, and had worked with a lot of red teamers. But I was more interested in the adversarial emulation aspect at that time. That's where my mind was at. And really, I got a lot of blank stares. The responses from most of the folks on the panel was, well, we know kind of once it's too late, typically we've been informed by a third party that we've been compromised, or typically, yeah, we've been informed, but at that point it's been too late. And so it was astonishing to me, like where I think we hadn't in 2013 been thinking about, well, we're gonna get compromised. That's not detrimental in itself. It's not good, but they haven't actually obtained confidential information or something that's detrimental to the business or the company. So you have all these chances before that happens to prove and to actually thwart an attacker. And so, what do you do when you're at a panel and you're passionate about something and you see that there's a problem and it's a big problem and no one has an answer? Well, you go quit your job. And that's what I did. I quit my job and started this company. It was all around, how do you make security measurable? I'm not going to talk about Attack IQ any more than to say the biggest problem I had, though, was that there was no standard framework to do this. This all goes back to MITRE ATT&CK. I had no ability going, okay, we're going to emulate attackers, but how do I actually show metrics? How do I show metrics in a way that's standardized, agreed upon from an industry standard? And there really wasn't. I had to really wait another 2 years, and the entire team that I was working on was trying our best to come up with something. The more appropriate thing, and the thing that actually occurred, was MITRE, as a nonprofit, introduced ATT&CK, and it's much more credible than had another company just said, okay, here's the framework that everyone has to agree to use. We were really happy to see that MITRE ATT&CK did this, and immediately, I started meeting with some of the founding R&D engineers at MITRE and just understanding what they had built. And so it was huge. I think today, the category that we're in wouldn't have existed to the degree that it does today if MITRE ATT&CK hadn't come along. But it had. And so, since that time, MITRE and myself have been talking a lot about MITRE ATT&CK. For my entire career, I've been on both the defensive side, building up security products, on the offensive side in services, and on the operational side as well. And it's something I think that was very much missing as a standard that we could talk about. And when we do talk about MITRE ATT&CK, we typically, and you can go to MITRE ATT&CK's website and you'll see that typically there's 4 primary use cases that I'm going to jump into and talk about. And if, again, I can't see the chat window, but Anil, maybe you'll let me know if there's any questions as anything comes up. The 4 primary use cases are around measuring detection logic, more about kind of granular rule sets, better and more actionable use of threat intelligence across a common lexicon, assessment engineering, which I don't think in it, this is how MITRE will kind of discuss it, but what that actually infers is, well, what are your threats? What security controls from an endpoint, network, cloud, identity, data perspective do you have? What coverage do you think that you have? You can equivocate this to thinking about a tabletop exercise when everybody gets around the room and they start looking, going, okay, these are our threats, and these are the TTPs that actually matter. What security technologies and controls do we have that we believe and assume will actually prevent and detect this type of behavior? And then lastly, and we talked about this with something similar to like the FIN6 emulation plan, how do we look end-to-end at an adversary that is inside of our network, starting to create behavior, and that we want to prove that we have the ability, if not at every phase of an attack path, to at some point, hopefully at the start, hopefully if not at the middle, but lastly, before they actually reach their goal, prevent them, and if not detect their behavior and respond before they're actually able to obtain the goal that they're after as an attacker. And so looking across a full kind of kill chain emulation perspective. So these are the 4 major use cases that MITRE ATT&CK will typically talk about, that I'll talk about. When I was at MITRE ATT&CK, which is all on my talk and the dozens of other talks that were there, is all on YouTube. So this last year was the 2nd time that they did it. The talks have always been phenomenal. You can always look at them on YouTube, behind the scenes, if you actually go to Virginia and attend the conference, they have a lot of working groups, a lot of birds of the feathers, a lot of folks that get together and discuss kind of similar problems that they're trying to solve and figuring out how MITRE ATT&CK is going to help them solve that. So again, the videos are fantastic, but if you have a chance, once we're able to and it's possible to attend in person, definitely do that. So with looking at detection as one of the major use cases, so AKA like testing detection logic, right? Looking at the analytics. The way that you should think about this in operationalizing MITRE ATT&CK is looking at your security stack. And a lot of the different tools, products, technologies within that security stack, they do what they do. You don't have to touch them. They have analytics and heuristics and machine learning and everything behind them. The classifiers are figuring out what exactly constitutes malicious behavior and has met certain thresholds. But in other cases, you have security technologies that you can tune and you can add in as the security team, add custom rule sets to. You can add a particular query. So think of Splunk, or think of any number of endpoint products. Think of Palo Alto. Think of, again, both endpoint and network side. What custom rule sets can you add from your security team's perspective that you've learned either from previous compromises, threat intelligence, or just tribal knowledge? And so as you think about it from an attacker perspective, one of the ways that you can use this and really operationalize this particular use case is to think of it the same way we think in the software world about unit testing, right? So you've got a particular rule in place. Great. How are you testing that? And so it's very valuable to go back to the attack knowledge base and think from the attacker perspective, knowing that you have a particular rule in place that looks malicious, and trying to find the TTPs, the atomic TTPs that align and map back to your rules. And you can think when you might have bought that particular solution, you wish you had started this process then. The reality is, if you didn't, you didn't, and it's best to start now, where you go back and you're like, okay, we have 50 different custom rules. We have 100. We have 500. Well, the guidance is to start at least at the most critical rules, right? And then have a project, have a priority list, and obviously start going so that every single query, every single rule that is custom within your security technology stack has an associated unit test. And that's how you should think of it. The detection logic and analytics is the ability finally to say, well, instead of me just waiting for that YAR rule to trigger once we've been actually hacked and compromised, let me go add a test here. Let me find a TTP and let me trigger it myself, or let the security team, whether you have a threat and vulnerability management function, or whether you have an offensive team, more than likely this is actually something that should be done by the owners of the security technology. And if they own that technology and they're the ones adding those rules, maybe that's the incident response team, they should actually have an associated TTP that they can trigger. And I'll talk about different tools that you can use to trigger those rules in the resource section at the end. But this is how you should think about this particular use case and operationalizing it. I don't know if there's any questions, Anil, on the chat. Let me know if there is.
None yet.
Okay.
I think you've answered all the questions.
Yeah. Okay. Are you saying I'm being very thorough?
Yes.
So this is something, and I discussed this actually at MITRE ATT&CK that I've seen huge success in starting in a great starting point. If you have an incident response team, if you deal with custom rules, if you want to actually showcase how each of those custom rules is working, is appropriate, is effective, this use case is for you. It's not always the case that there might be a use case, but you don't have the particular team or capability, so it doesn't apply. I have a few notes in here, and this is actually just tribal knowledge I think that I've gained in the last 5 or so years when working with attack and specifically looking at the techniques is that not all the techniques alone will trigger a rule. I've kind of said that where many security technologies on the endpoint or the network need to see a certain amount of actions happen either in sequence that meet a certain threshold or in succession of one another and in a cohesive manner. A technique might be run and then another technique might be run. It's important how you run those techniques. If they're run completely independently, that might not be the way that an attacker uses them. And so understand that an endpoint might not actually trigger. The other case is context matters. I mentioned this before, but when you're executing and testing out some of these TTPs to try to operationalize and test out your unique rule, and you're trying to use a technique like account creation. Well, if you're an administrator, account creation is a fairly normal thing to do. But if you're not an administrator, it's potentially not, and it's suspicious. And so context in terms of what user account is running these techniques absolutely matters. So take that into account. And then also take into account there's going to be techniques where detection is really difficult, if not impossible. An example, when you're taking data and exfiltration, and you're exfiltrating over a DNS text record or null record, you more than likely do not have a security technology that can detect that type of behavior. Maybe you do, but there's many examples of this that it's not obvious that a technique can be caught. And maybe there's a different way and a different technique that a attacker is using that can be caught more easily. Again, I go back into the slide that we saw earlier with these techniques of understanding what a technique is, and again understanding the procedural component as you go searching through MITRE ATT&CK's matrix, and hopefully excited that you can basically start replicating and emulating some of these techniques. Do understand that the procedural aspect is really important, and MITRE ATT&CK or knowledge base does give examples. And that's really important as you go and you find the tactic area that you want to emulate. Maybe it's execution, or I'm kind of looking at the list here. Maybe it's credential access or lateral movement. And you dive into a technique and you look at a sub-technique in the knowledge base of MITRE ATT&CK, then it's very important to find how is this used maliciously so that you can replicate and emulate that behavior. If you're still kind of like looking, going, where do I start? Because MITRE ATT&CK, I think I had put some number, has some 250, some sub techniques. Where do I start? There's a few different lists. MITRE ATT&CK has a top 20. Attack IQ has a dirty dozen. Red Canary has a top 20. Dave Kennedy's company Trusted Sec, I think, also has a top 20 of the techniques that they see more commonly. And again, as you can see, even in Red Canary's #1 technique is PowerShell. And again, I go back to we all just have to recognize that PowerShell is not inherently malicious, but can be used in a malicious way. So it's very important to go back and say, well, let me look at the knowledge base within MITRE ATT&CK, see how it is used maliciously. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to move on to the next kind of major use case. Anil, is there any questions on the chat?
No questions.
Okay. You guys can hear me prompting you. If there's any questions, please go ahead and ask them, and I'll try my best. So use case number 2, I kind of combined just because, again, through my observation of working with a lot of different teams that operationalize MITRE ATT&CK, and you can see examples of this if you go back to MITRE ATT&CK Con. There's a lot of teams that talk about how they've used it. They might have a threat intelligence team. They might not. Not every team, your organization might be a little bit smaller. In one case, I remember at MITRE ATT&CK Con, they actually had hired an intern to do some research in the local ISACs and basically determine, based off the industry, what are the threat actors that are targeting us. Then they'd go back to MITRE ATT&CK, find TTPs that were relevant, and they would start to build using, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, MITRE Navigator, which is a tool within MITRE ATT&CK, to kind of highlight relevant TTPs that were more than likely relevant to their organization based off the threat actors that were targeting them and the TTPs that those threat actors used. And so, one very important aspect of using MITRE ATT&CK is how can we better use existing threat intelligence to make decisions to understand what are the threats and the risks to our organization that then should map to associated mitigation controls that prevent and detect and allow us to respond if that threat is actually realized once an attacker gets inside the network. And so going through a color code heat map exercise is fun. Again, MITRE ATT&CK has Navigator. And you can go to if you don't have a threat intel team, maybe your intern is excited to work on this project within the security team. If you do, fantastic. You can take the threat intelligence feeds that you're getting, and this year at MITRE ATT&CK, they had an entire workshop on how to read through some of the threat intel reports, both privately and publicly, and how to start mapping that to the language. Going, okay, well, if this paragraph is talking about a particular set of behaviors, this is how to interpret that in terms of how we call it at MITRE ATT&CK, in terms of a naming convention and the techniques. And so as you read through the threat intelligence reports, disseminating that, categorizing it, and then putting it into kind of this heat map exercise has proven to be very, very valuable for many security teams. And then they'll maintain actually within MITRE Navigator a layer of the techniques that are relevant to their team. And then on the flip side of that, well, that's the threats. What about the coverage? What about the controls that we have? And so another huge use case is actually what MITRE ATT&CK will call assessment and engineering. And it's going through and measuring your defensive capabilities. It's a hugely useful resource when you're thinking about investment planning and looking at the infrastructure that's preventing and detecting malicious behavior from accessing kind of all the applications within the infrastructure. And so, as we look at that, I'll give you one example of implementation, right? This is a talk that Chris Gates and Chris Nickerson did at BrewCon a number of years ago. These guys are great. And they kind of demonstrated how they had gone through and built kind of a color key, whether their control had no detection, whether it was logging and alerting, whether it was able to actually prevent completely. And once they did that, they started looking through the TTPs, focusing on a few of the technology controls that they had. And they kind of used this as a tabletop exercise. They said, okay, well, this is or assumption. We believe that we can detect. We believe that we can prevent it. We believe here we'll have a partial detection in the sense that it'll log, but it might not alert the incident response team to take action. We believe that we have partial prevention, which might mean that some of the infrastructure has policies turned on that would prevent it. And in other cases, other areas of the network might not. And so they started actually, this is kind of an Excel worksheet type methodology, going through that list and then mapping that to the various controls that they had from an endpoint perspective or network perspective. Yeah, it's time consuming, but it's very, very valuable. And so this is a talk that they gave at BrewCon that I think it's worth following up if you guys are interested again in MITRE ATT&CK and looking a little deeper how they implemented kind of going through and mapping controls to relevant TTPs. Another major use case is when we're looking at adversarial emulation. This is kind of where I live and breathe these days, because I'm all for atomic techniques. I think they have a value, especially when you're talking about custom rule sets. But I think it's been one of the negative points. Again, we talk about MITRE ATT&CK bingo, but it's been one of the negative points when we look so granularly at a technique. It's very important to have a common lexicon to describe that technique. Solid examples as to what threat actors are using those techniques, procedural examples, exactly how they're using that technique. But in itself, it's also given this false sense of security, if you will, that I've seen dozens and dozens of teams try to go and emulate a particular technique and say, hey, we have no coverage for it. And the answer from a lot of the security vendors has been, well, that technique alone is not malicious. You have to understand that, and this is the response that I've seen from a lot of security vendors, that there's different types of logic behind the scenes in security controls, right? Some are more heuristic space from a threshold perspective. Some look at behavioral aspect, what process actually started. Does that process normally spawn this other child process? And so most of these security controls, one way or another though, a very granular technique run on its own is not going to be enough. And they feel that an adversary would not just execute one technique on its own. They would execute a technique, given a certain amount of time and a process still running, execute another technique. Or if a technique was run on its own in itself isn't malicious enough to cause true detrimental harm. So you can imagine, again, I'll go back to Mimikatz because probably most of us are familiar with it, using a tool like Mimikatz to inject into LSAS, dump administrative credentials if those are present, use those to execute a technique like, pass the ticket, open up an admin share, and then pop to another box. And so you can see, that might have sounded like two things happen, but a multitude of different techniques happen between those, dumping of credentials and accessing a secondary machine. And so a security control vendor would most likely say, somewhere along that attack path, we're going to either detect that behavior or outright prevent it, depending on the policy. And so I'm a big fan of adversarial emulation, sequencing together cohesively several techniques. And I think this allows you, as you look at MITRE ATT&CK, to really emulate an attacker, to validate that the control in question or the technology in question, although it didn't catch every single phase, that it was able to detect something in that attack path in order to respond to it. And if there potentially is a phase within that attack path that you really believe should have been caught, for you to go back, talk to the vendor, or talk to maybe the administrator of, if you're the incident response team, go back to the administrator of whatever security product you're talking about and saying, hey, is there a configuration change we can make so that maybe there was a feature we didn't turn on and we could actually even better detect that phase of the attack path? Even though we got it, we want to actually get it earlier on. Because as we look at an attack path, we look, from left to right. And if you're familiar with like the Verizon DBI report, which comes out every year, it's something that they talked a lot about last year, was looking at attack patterns and attack paths when you think about your controls. And obviously you can think about it in the most simple way of looking at it from start, middle, and end. Where would you most likely detect an attacker? Would it be once they gain persistence on the machine and start kind of doing discovery, start disabling certain functions that are going to allow them to kind of make a kind of a further foothold? That's kind of the beginning stage. Is it at the middle stage where they might actually start having dumped credentials and maybe having access to administrative credentials, move to another machine, doing further discovery, further scanning? And then lastly, is it maybe at the later stage where they've actually accessed what they were after, and potentially to stay under the radar, they're exfiltrating that information slowly, potentially over a non-obvious protocol, And so, there's different really stages at the beginning, middle, and end, where you can kind of look at a full emulation plan and kind of discover, given not just one security technology, but multiple, at what parts, when you actually replicated an emulation plan with the various technologies, detect or prevent different behaviors, different techniques. And so it's very valuable. And so I'm a huge fan of adversarial emulation, which kind of looks at across the board. One big resource I recommend is the MITRE ATT&CK evaluation lab. And so every year for the past few years, MITRE ATT&CK has released these evaluation results, and the goal is actually, I think it's a solid goal, which is to not become another, AV test or, kind of mechanism to really just score a particular security vendor against each other. The goal is to have a conversation about capabilities. And so I think it's a very worthy goal where MITRE ATT&CK is trying to take a particular threat actor. Again, in this latest case, it was Fin6, and previous past, it's been APT29, and replicate the behavior from start, middle, and end. And again, an attack, like a threat actor, doesn't have just one attack path; it has multiple. And so, taking the number of previously documented attack paths that a particular threat actor will have, and replicating that, and then documenting, because they have a lab and they have all the security vendors, how did each of these do? Not necessarily just against each other, but what capabilities do they have in their ability to detect the various techniques? And it just showcases how, in many cases, not every EDR vendor is built the same. There are various areas and techniques that they might do a better job at. And they make all the results completely publicly available for analysis. But it's also a great way to learn about just emulation plans in general, and learn about kind of start, middle, and end of an attacker journey to probably better your defenses. Okay, so
there was one question.
Yep.
They're asking if the attack navigator you're referring to, they're referencing a GitHub.
Yes, that's
repository?
exactly the one.
Okay.
Yep.
Just want to make sure.
Yeah. Thanks for the questions. It makes it more fun on my end, guys. So I appreciate it. Navigator again was a project with MITRE and a few other partners that they released. Again, fantastic resource, free to use. You'll see on Navigator, and kind of on the left-hand side, you can start to highlight, or excuse me, on the right top-hand side, you can start to say, well, show me all techniques related to APT34, right? And then you can color code that and heat map it. Super simple, so you don't have to deal with kind of Excel files. And then you can save that, and then you could create several layers and overlay that with your products and technologies. And it really lends itself to incredible conversations amongst the team that has the knowledge about what threats are likely in the organization, and then the team that has more knowledge about the detection technologies. It doesn't matter if your team is 2 people, it doesn't matter if your team is 50 people. It has truly kind of brought these teams together to talk the same language and actually be on the same team, if you will, to talk about how do we better our defenses, really, at the end of the day. So, one of the big things I want to talk about here is we talked about MITRE ATT&CK, and we talked about, the various use cases. The most important thing is, if this type of topic has interested you, and this is something that you do today or that you want to do, how do you not only start doing it, because that's the use cases, but actually start representing it in such a way that it matters more to your security team, matters more to other teams, matters more to kind of the business as a whole. And I say that just because, I think, having been in security 20 plus years, I've had friends that have worked at national labs, and we have these interesting conversations where they're like, yeah, we found this vulnerability, we found this issue, and we all think it's massive, but we went back to the organization and they have to do kind of a cost-based analysis of, well, is that threat a big enough risk to the business? And over the years, it really changes your mentality when you're like, yeah, living in the very, very technical world I lived in for so many years, like that's the world I enjoy, talking about the threats, talking about the risks, talking about the techniques, talking about how you move around, talking about how a defensive, technology or a particular rule might be the right one to actually catch that behavior, and jumping back and forth between kind of the technical aspects of the threat and the defensive strategy, and I loved it. But it became more and more apparent over the number of years that it's so important at that point to then represent it back to the team and other teams as to why is that important? How should we make our decisions? Because we have to prioritize things. We can't do everything, and that might mean different machines have to go, go down as we have to update things, or it might mean investment in different controls if that's what we have to actually stop. So help us understand how to prioritize that. So I just want to talk a little bit to that. One way to represent it back to the different teams. The work that you're doing potentially with MITRE ATT&CK, if you choose to use it, is to actually build out a threat model. So again, you might have a threat intelligence team, you might have individuals on your team that are interested in just threats in general, that are relevant to the business, relevant to the teams, relevant to the infrastructure where applications are hosted. Again, going back to Navigator, open up Navigator and start having good conversations with the teams of what should we be concerned with, and starting to highlight that. It becomes very visual to understand, are we having a lot of gaps earlier in kind of the attacker kill chain aspect, or are we having gaps more in the middle? Or is there particular areas that we should focus on? And then you can talk about prioritization. And that's where it kind of gets to the next level of just looking at wanting to go back to the team and say, no, we need this tool, we need this technology, or we need these resources. Well, having built that threat model using MITRE ATT&CK, it's very easy to say, okay, well, here are the set of TTPs we believe are risk, here are gaps, and then going back and visualizing what technologies cover what types of threats. There might be actually overlap. There might be a reason to get rid of some technologies because there's the rationalization conversation you can have, or not. And so again, I think Navigator is a fantastic tool for tracking, but it's also a fantastic way to have that conversation with your own team, other teams, those that need to speak a little bit higher up on the stack of past the threat, and saying, well, help us understand why we need to make an investment in this particular control. And this kind of visual representation, as simple as it sounds, really, I've observed that it helps quite a bit. And it kind of goes back into, and again, this was a conversation that was just given at the CISA Security Summit. So if, again, another recommendation, if you're bored at home and looking for YouTube videos that are actually interesting, that are educational too, this security summit, I think, was just made live recently. But talking about a MITRE ATT&CK and providing kind of a risk kind of summary aspect of, as your teams have discussions about the inherent risk, building out threat models, understanding the TTPs, prioritizing the TTPs, actually doing some diagnostics, and I'll talk in a second about the resources available to be able to use those TTPs and measure your effectiveness of what you have, and then justifying why go buy something, why get rid of something, why make changes to something. Again, you're kind of going from the threat aspect all the way to making a business case for what you need to do. The kind of more detailed examples is like, SentinelOne or CrowdStrike. How do you actually demonstrate this? So if you jump into a product like SentinelOne, you'll actually see that they have a whole feature set to like turn on and off lateral movement engines, or document and scripts nefarious actions. That's the best way, I would say, as opposed to just blanketly looking at an entire vendor to say, well, let me jump in, look at the configurations, and then find related scenarios back to the features and the capabilities of a particular product. That's how I would recommend going out, kind of, and organizing your thought methodology with testing. Same thing with CrowdStrike. You kind of jump in, you look at configurations, and this is true with most vendors. You look in, and it's not just how do I test CrowdStrike, how do I test SentinelOne, how do I test X, Y, and Z. You actually look to see what policies are turned on, what feature capabilities are turned on, and then associate that with TTPs or emulation plans for testing. You can do this again with full attack paths, and again, present it in such a way that you're like, well, let's look at SentinelOne against APT33. Let's look at a full attack path of using PowerShell to download Mimikatz, executing Mimikatz, using that to pass the ticket. What was detected, what was prevented, all you care about is something was, at the end of the day, whether it was the start or the middle, hopefully earlier rather than later, was prevented or detected with enough time for you to respond. So it's another way to represent it back visually to say, listen, we're testing these controls against these actors that are relevant to our industry, and here's how we've tested it in results. Again, so these are the major use cases. Above all, if you do nothing else with MITRE ATT&CK, like the lexicon has been probably the largest thing that everybody can benefit from. Using the same language. I know I didn't discuss that too much, but that has been enormously helpful for many teams. And anytime that you actually do use MITRE, an attack to demonstrate defensive versus the threats, mentioning again, and I kind of showed this above here, as you saw, like what department are we talking about? What are the applications that are on that you're testing this control and this adversarial plan and emulation plan against? It makes a huge difference. So here are some of the resources, and again, we'll make this available or take a quick screenshot, however you want to do it. But Caldera is MITRE's kind of proof of concept emulation tool. Navigator is what we talked about. Palo Alto is just one example that has a lot of playbooks talking about emulation plans. The last thing I'll talk about is, again, I'm huge into educating about MITRE ATT&CK. And so the last resource here is Attack IQ Academy. It's free. I think we give CPE credits out, but it does a lot of teachings around MITRE ATT&CK and MITRE ATT&CK and purple teaming, and we have a lot of the attack folks come on there. So that's everything I wanted to present. Any questions from anybody?
It looks like everybody's giving a thumbs up. Thank you. And
Okay.
we got a best of class presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephan. Really appreciate it. We want to just remind everybody that MITRE ATT&CK is open and available to any person or organization at no charge.
That's right.
So please do consider using this valuable resource, and thanks, Stephan, for explaining it to us. I think a lot of people on this meetup probably learned about this for the first time. So it's a great resource. It's really hard to fight the adversaries. They're all sharing ideas and knowledge, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So, stuff like this is our answer. We're sharing too. So.
I did have one quick question. Just out of curiosity, I know you mentioned MITRE ATT&CK, I think it was. Do you know when that is? How can we get involved? Is there any way we can take advantage and engage with the community with regards to this?
Yeah. Well, Google is our friend. MITRE ATT&CK. If you just go to the MITRE ATT&CK portal, and as Richard said, everything that I've talked about today is free for use, is open for everyone in terms of the knowledge base. On there, typically I'm just jogging my memory. This year, as Richard had, you put the I think August date. What day is it? It's Blur's Day. I don't know. It's like, so when was MITRE ATT&CK? I almost feel like it was something like 6 or 8 months ago. I believe it was something in the first or second quarter of every year. And so they'll, on MITRE ATT&CK's website, they will have information. And if you haven't attended, again, there's some great things that happen in person, but they've done a fantastic job. One of the most professional jobs of just storing all the videos and presenting it. Again, if I had to pick a few conferences, AppSec Cali would be up there, MITRE ATT&CK would be up there. Those are two phenomenal places to spend your time and learn some things. But that's where you'd find the dates.
All right, so we would love to thank you again and thank everyone who's joined us. We're a couple of minutes off over the hour, but that's okay. Lots of good stuff, great questions too. Thank you all for participating in this. Became interactive, which is the best. And I speak sometimes, and Stephan will agree. These Zoom meetings are hard sometimes without audience interaction. There's no eyes to look into. So when you ask the questions, you're doing the speaker a great favor, and it also helps the flow in the conversation. So thanks to all of you who are participating. Stephan, thanks again for driving all the way up to LA on your computer.
I was confused what we were supposed to do. Thanks, Richard.
Yeah. And, just as a reminder to what we used to experience, I wore these things, you know, they give away things that you can put on your badge at a conference. I don't know if you can see mine right here, but many people have said that it's appropriate. So there you go, just as a homage. Anyway, we're out of time. We'll see you all next month at the 4th Wednesday for another great session. Have a safe ride back, Stephan, and to everybody, think about some of the great points you shared with us. Stay safe. If you're not an OWASP member, consider joining this week so you can vote in the election. And we'll see you in a month, and hopefully before too long in person. Keep our fingers crossed. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.